aunt handed me a $20 bill across the Thanksgiving table in front of 23 people and said, "Here, sweetie, go buy yourself something nice. Lord knows that little job of yours doesn't pay much." She said it the way you'd say it to a child. Soft voice. Pitying smile. The kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the bill sitting on the table between us. And I thought about the meeting I had that Monday morning where I'd signed off on a $2.4 million infrastructure contract. Her county's water treatment expansion, the one her husband's firm had been lobbying for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because the beginning matters. It always does. I grew up in a house where achievement was the only language my father's side of the family spoke fluently. My dad was the quiet one, the one who worked overnight shifts at a distribution center for most of my childhood, who came home smelling like cardboard and pure wax, who never once complained about it. His sister, my Aunt Miriam, married a man named Patrick, who owned a chain of car dealerships and made sure everyone knew it. Their daughter, my cousin Stephanie, was 2 years older than me and had been the family's golden child for as long as I could remember. Stephanie graduated from Georgetown, married a cardiologist, lives in a house in Northern Virginia with a circular driveway and one of those kitchens you see in magazines where no one actually cooks. And then there was me. I went to Penn State. Not the wrong choice. Actually an excellent school, and I worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for a good portion of it myself. But in my aunt's world, Penn State was what you said when you couldn't get in anywhere that mattered. I remember being 17 and mentioning it at a family dinner, and Aunt Miriam had tilted her head and said, "Oh, Penn State? Well, that's practical. Practical." The way she said it, it sounded like a consolation prize. I studied environmental engineering. That confused everyone too. My grandmother kept telling people I was going into science, which was close enough. My mum understood. She'd grown up near a river that turned orange every spring from runoff and had her own feelings about that. But most of my dad's family just sort of nodded and moved on, the way people do when they don't know what to say and don't care enough to ask. After graduation, I got a job with the state. Entry level, nothing glamorous. I was part of a team that assessed municipal water infrastructure, basically figuring out which pipes were about to fail, which treatment plants needed upgrades, where the money needed to go. It was unglamorous work. A lot of field visits. A lot of spreadsheets. A lot of meetings with local officials who resented having a 23-year-old woman tell them their systems were 30 years out of compliance. I loved it. I moved up faster than I expected, partly because I was good at it, and partly because the field had a retention problem. People burned out or moved to the private sector for better pay, and the ones who stayed tended to get promoted. By the time I was 28, I was managing a regional team. By 30, I was the deputy director. None of that made it into family conversations. Part of that was my fault, I'll admit it. When my aunt or my grandmother asked what I did, I gave vague answers. Water infrastructure, I'd say. Environmental compliance. Their eyes would glaze before I finished the sentence. Once, Aunt Miriam had asked if I was like inspecting sewers. And when I'd started to explain the actual scope of the work, she'd looked over my shoulder at someone more interesting and said, "That's nice, honey." After that, I stopped explaining. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I wasn't doing this work for their approval. Both of those things were true. But somewhere underneath the truth, I was also quietly hurt every time I showed up at a holiday and got treated like the cousin who hadn't quite figured it out yet. The year I turned 32, I was appointed regional director for water and environmental infrastructure for our state. It covered 11 counties. It meant I was responsible for compliance oversight, capital project approvals, and a department budget that was, in that fiscal year, just over $40 million. It was a big deal. There was a small article in the state paper. My mom framed it. None of my dad's family mentioned it. I don't know if they saw it. I don't know if they looked. That November, my grandmother decided she wanted a big Thanksgiving. She was 78 and had been through a rough summer, a hip replacement, and then a lung infection that had scared all of us. And she said she wanted everyone together. Real together. So we rented out the back room of a restaurant in town. The kind of place was white tablecloths and a pre-6C menu, and 23 people came. It was the first time in years the whole family had been in one room. The dinner started fine. My grandmother looked better than she had in months. My dad was relaxed in a way I didn't often see him. No early shift tomorrow, nothing to get back for. Stephanie showed up 45 minutes late with her husband, the cardiologist, who immediately launched into a monologue about a golf trip and didn't really stop until the appetizers. I was seated at the far end of the table from my grandmother, between my dad and a second cousin I barely knew. That was fine. I wasn't there to perform. I was there for my grandmother. About halfway through the main course, my aunt started doing the things she always did at family gatherings. The inventory, going around the table asking people about their lives. Except it wasn't really asking. It was more like narrating a documentary she'd already written. She talked about Stephanie's new kitchen renovation. She talked about her son-in-law's practice expanding. She talked about Patrick's dealerships doing well despite everything. Then she got to me. "And Cassie," she said. She's always called me Cassie, which I've never gone by. "Still doing the government thing." "Still doing it," I said. She nodded the way you nod at a child's drawing. "Well, it's good to have job security. That's what I always say. You can't put a price on knowing your paycheck's coming." A few people at the table smiled politely. I watched my dad look down at his plate. My cousin Stephanie's husband made some comment about government workers having it easy and then laughed, and a couple of people laughed with him because he was the kind of man who expected people to laugh with him. I didn't say anything. And then my Aunt Miriam opened her purse. She pulled out her wallet, and I want to be precise about this because it matters. She pulled out a $20 bill, and she leaned across the table, and she placed it in front of me the way you'd leave a tip for a waiter. And she said, "Here, sweetie. Go buy yourself something nice. Lord knows that a little job of yours doesn't pay much." She was smiling. She genuinely thought she was being generous. The table went quiet for a second. Not the whole table. The conversations at the far end kept going. But the people near us went quiet. My dad's jaw tightened. My second cousin looked suddenly very interested in her roasted potatoes. I looked at the bill. I looked at my aunt. I said quietly, "I'm good, thank you." She shrugged and put it back. "Suit yourself. The offer stands." And just like that, the conversation moved on. I spent the rest of the dinner being polite. I asked my grandmother about her physical therapy. I talked to my dad about whether he wanted to come visit me next month. I was pleasant and present and completely fine on the outside. Inside, I was thinking about the meeting I had that Monday. The background on that: Patrick's dealerships had expanded into commercial fleet vehicles a couple of years back. County vehicles, municipal contracts, that kind of thing. And in doing so, they'd gotten tangled up in a bid for a county contract that fell under our regional oversight. The county in question was one of the 11 I covered. The contract required environmental compliance certification before it could proceed. My office had been holding that certification for 4 months. There were legitimate issues. A disposal protocol for vehicle fluids that didn't meet our current standards, and a site drainage plan that needed revision. We'd sent 3 rounds of comments. Patrick's firm had responded slowly, partially, in ways that suggested they didn't think they needed to take us seriously. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I had a meeting with their compliance consultant to go over the final deficiencies. It was a routine meeting. It had been on the calendar for 3 weeks. I want to be honest here. I was not going to let what happened at dinner affect how I did my job. That's important to me. I wasn't going to slow walk their certification out of spite, and I wasn't going to fast track it out of some desire to seem magnanimous. The process was the process, but I was human enough to note the irony. The consultant, a man named Roland, walked into that Monday meeting clearly expecting a rubber stamp. He told his client the issues were minor. He seemed surprised when I sat down with a 20-page review and started going through the outstanding items line by line. "These are the same comments from the last round," he said, about 40 minutes in. "They are," I said, "because they haven't been addressed. I was under the impression we'd resolved the drainage issue. The drainage issue was revised, but the revision introduced a new problem with the retention basin sizing. It's in section 4 of the comments. We sent that 6 weeks ago." He looked at his folder. He hadn't read section 4. We were in that meeting for 2.5 hours. At the end, I told him the certification could be issued as soon as the outstanding items were resolved, fully resolved, and not before. I told him my team was available to answer technical questions. and that we wanted to help them get there. I meant that. He thanked me stiffly and left. I don't know exactly when Patrick figured out who was sitting across the table from his consultant. Maybe that day, maybe later. I wasn't trying to make a point of it. I was just doing my job. About 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving dinner, my dad called me. He sounded strange, kind of careful, like he was choosing his words. He said Aunt Miriam had called him. She'd been looking into something. He wasn't sure how it came up. And she'd realized that the regional director her husband had been dealing with, the one holding up the contract, was me. She seemed surprised, my dad said. I imagine so, I said. He paused. She asked if you could just, move things along. As a favor to family. I took a breath. Dad. I know, he said quickly. I know, I told her that's not how it works. It's not how it works, I said. And even if it were, I wouldn't. There are real issues with that contract that need to be fixed. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry she did that. You don't need to apologize for her. I know that too. Another pause. I'm proud of you, I don't think I say it enough. That was the moment I almost cried. Not at the dinner, not at the $20 bill, not at any of the years of being brushed off. That quiet sentence from my dad on a Tuesday night while I was sitting in my car in a parking garage. I don't think I say it enough. I stayed on the phone with him for another hour. We talked about nothing in particular. It was one of the best conversations we'd had in years. The contract issue got resolved about a month later. Patrick's people finally brought in a different engineer who actually addressed the technical problems, and we issued the certification the week before Christmas. Clean process, nothing unusual. I signed off on it myself. A few days before Christmas, Aunt Miriam called me directly. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was long and somewhat convoluted, something about how she hadn't realized the scope of my position, how she'd always admired my work ethic, how maybe she should have asked more questions over the years. She didn't apologize for the $20, not directly, but she did say near the end of the message, I think I may have underestimated you. I hope you know it was never meant unkindly. I listened to it twice. I thought about calling back. I didn't, that day. I went to my grandmother's instead, just the two of us, the way we'd started doing on Christmas Eve a few years back. She lives in a small house now, a good one, in a neighborhood I helped her find. We ate takeout Thai food and watched old movies, and she asked me real questions. About the work, about what it meant, about whether I was happy. She'd known about my job for years, she'd asked, and I'd told her and she'd listened. She wasn't impressed by titles. She was impressed that I cared about something. Your grandfather grew up without clean water, she said, not for the first time. When he was a boy, the well would go bad and people got sick. He never took a glass of water for granted his whole life. I know, I said. You're doing something real, she said. She patted my hand. Don't let anyone make you forget that. I called my aunt back on December 27th. I kept it brief, and I kept it warm. Not cold, not triumphant, just ordinary. She seemed relieved. We talked for about 15 minutes about nothing important. She mentioned that Patrick was hoping to bid on a few more county contracts next year. I said that was good to hear and that my team's job was to help projects get into compliance, not to stand in the way. She said she knew that now. I don't know if this story has the ending some people would want. Nobody stood up at the dinner table and made a speech. Nobody had a dramatic confrontation in front of all 23 relatives. I didn't slide the $20 back across the table with some perfectly timed one-liner. Life doesn't usually work that way. What actually happened is quieter than that. A woman who spent years letting her family misread her eventually ended up in a room where the misreading had professional consequences. No revenge, just reality, catching up. I did call my aunt back. I do show up to family things, though less than I used to. I talk to my dad almost every week now, real conversations, not just check-ins. My grandmother is doing well. Better than the doctors expected, honestly. The $20 bill my aunt put in front of me, I've thought about it more than I probably should. Not because it hurt me, or not only because it hurt me, but because of what it said about what she'd been seeing all those years. Not me, A version of me she'd invented and never questioned. I think a lot of people have someone like that in their family. Someone who decided who you were a long time ago and never updated the picture. The hard thing isn't being underestimated. You can survive being underestimated. The hard thing is realizing that some people aren't going to see you clearly, no matter what you do, and deciding that it's their loss, not yours, and actually believing it. I'm still working on believing it, if I'm being honest. But I'm further along than I was. The $20 bill sat on that table for maybe 4 seconds before my aunt put it back in her wallet. 4 seconds, that's all it was. But I've thought about those 4 seconds more than I've thought about a lot of things that actually lasted. What strikes me now isn't the humiliation of it, though that was real, and I won't pretend it wasn't. What strikes me is how completely she believed she was being kind. That's the part that stays with me. She wasn't being cruel in the way people are cruel when they know what they're doing. She was being cruel the way people are when they've never had to question the picture they carry of someone else. She'd decided who I was around the time I said Penn State at a dinner table. And she'd never once picked up the frame to look behind it. I spent years being vague about my work because I'd learned slowly and then all at once that the people who needed context the most were the least interested in receiving it. That's not an excuse. I know now that I could have pushed harder, said it plainly, made them sit with the discomfort of being wrong. But there's a kind of quiet dignity in not performing your accomplishments for people who've already written you off. I held on to that. Maybe too tightly, for too long. What I know is this. The work I did was real, whether anyone in that room understood it or not. The pipes that got fixed, the water systems that came into compliance, the contracts that moved because someone went through them line by line and refused to cut corners. None of that required their acknowledgement to matter. That's something I had to learn to actually believe, not just say. There's a difference. My dad called me that night after Thanksgiving and said he was proud of me. Not because of the title. Not because of the $40 million budget or the 11 counties or any of it. Just proud of the person I'd become without anyone handing it to me. I think about that more than the $20. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on a resume. The kind that figures out how to keep going inside a system that wasn't built for you. How to do the work right even when the shortcuts are available. How to stay decent when being petty would feel so much better. I'm not sure I always got that right. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving, sitting across from Roland with my 20-page review, I'd be lying if I said there was no satisfaction in it. But I didn't let that satisfaction change how I did my job. That line matters. It's the only line that does. What happened between my aunt and me wasn't justice, exactly. The contract got approved when it deserved to be approved. Patrick's business continued. Aunt Miriam left a voicemail that circled around an apology without quite landing on one. Life went on, mostly unchanged, for everyone involved. Except that my dad and I talk on the phone almost every week now. Real conversations. And my grandmother told me I was doing something real, and she meant it in the way that people mean things when they don't have anything to prove. That's what I carried out of that year. Not a victory, just clarity, about who had actually been paying attention all along, and who never really needed to change their mind, because they never stopped seeing me clearly in the first place. I'm still working on letting the rest of it go, but I'm further along than I was.